hospital doors burst open as Adrian Cole ran down the corridor, his breath ragged, his heart pounding like it was racing death itself. Minutes ago, they had told him his wife was dying. Minutes ago, he was still a husband with hope. Then a trembling doctor grabbed his arm, eyes wild with fear, and whispered words that made no sense. "Hide. It's a trap." Before Adrian could ask why, the operating room lights flared on, and there she was, standing, awake, calm, not a patient fighting for her life, but a woman watching him like she had been waiting. In that frozen second, injustice hit him harder than panic. Something was wrong, something cruel, and whatever this was, it wasn't just about surgery. It was about lies, power, and a truth buried deep inside that hospital. Before we dive into this story, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is in your part of the world. And if you enjoy intense, cinematic stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Long before the night the hospital lights burned his eyes, Adrian Cole had believed his life was ordinary in the best way. He had met Lena when they were both young and hungry for stability, not greatness. Back then, she laughed easily, leaned into his shoulder when the world felt heavy, and spoke about a future that sounded simple: home, partnership, trust. Adrian had fallen for that softness. He had built his choices around protecting it. He worked longer hours so she could go back to school. He turned down a promotion that required relocation because Lena said she needed consistency. When his father warned him that love should never require erasing yourself, Adrian smiled and said some sacrifices were worth it. He meant it, at least. He thought he did. As the years passed, Lena changed in ways that were subtle enough to excuse, but sharp enough to wound. Her conversations grew shorter, more strategic. She listened less and calculated more. Success hardened her posture, sharpened her voice. She stopped asking Adrian's opinion and started informing him of decisions already made. When he tried to bring it up, she dismissed him gently, the way one might calm a child who doesn't understand the bigger picture. "You worry too much," she would say, brushing past him, already checking her phone. "Everything I do is for us." Adrian wanted to believe that. He wanted to believe the distance between them was temporary. That ambition didn't have to mean abandonment. So he adapted. He learned to read her moods, to avoid questions that led to silence, to celebrate her achievements quietly from the sidelines. Love, he told himself, was flexible. Love endured. The first sign that something was truly wrong came months before the hospital incident. On a night that seemed insignificant at the time, Lena had collapsed at home without warning. One moment she was standing in the kitchen. The next she was on the floor, her skin pale, her breathing shallow. The ambulance arrived fast. The doctors spoke in hushed, careful tones. Tests were ordered. Diagnoses changed. No one could explain why a woman so healthy on paper looked like she was slowly slipping away. From that night on, hospitals became a second home. White corridors, waiting rooms that smelled like disinfectant and fear. Lena drifted in and out of treatments that sounded important but were explained vaguely. Adrian asked questions. He was told not to worry. He asked more. He was told to trust the process. Trust came easily to Adrian. Or at least, it used to. What unsettled him most was not Lena's illness, but her reaction to it. She showed no fear, no frustration. She accepted every procedure without hesitation, signed forms without reading them, and discouraged Adrian from staying too long. When he tried to sleep in the chair beside her bed, she asked him to go home. "You look exhausted," she said once, her voice flat. "There's no point in both of us suffering." It sounded considerate. It felt wrong. Adrian noticed other things too. Doctors who changed too often, nurses who avoided eye contact, conversations that stopped when he entered the room. One night, he overheard his wife speaking on the phone in a low, controlled voice that didn't sound sick at all. When he asked who it was, she said it was work. Even then, lying in a hospital bed, work still came first. Guilt became his constant companion. Maybe he was being paranoid. Maybe stress was warping his judgment. After all, his wife was the one fighting for her life. Who was he to doubt her? So he kept quiet. He sat in waiting rooms and prayed. He signed consent forms he barely understood. He told himself that marriage meant standing by someone, even when you didn't fully recognize them anymore. The night of the emergency surgery call shattered that fragile self-deception. The hospital had phoned him close to midnight. Urgency heavy in every word. Lena's condition had suddenly worsened. They said it was critical. They said he needed to come immediately. Adrian didn't even lock the door when he left the house. Now, standing in a maintenance corridor, pressed against a cold wall, as alarms echoed nearby, Adrian replayed every moment of their marriage, like a crime scene, revisited too late. The doctor's warning rang in his ears, sharp and unreal. Hide. It's a trap. A trap for whom? He thought of Lena's calm eyes in the operating room, of the way she hadn't looked, surprised to see him, of the faintest curve of her lips, not quite a smile, not quite regret. In that instant, Adrian understood something terrifying. Whatever was happening had been unfolding for a long time, and he had been the last to know. The injustice burned hotter than fear. He had given everything: his time, his trust, his identity to a woman who might never have been the person he loved. And now, in the place where lives were meant to be saved, he was being hunted, silenced, erased. Adrian clenched his fists, forcing his breathing to slow. Running blindly would only finish what had already begun. If this was a trap, then someone had set it carefully, which meant there were rules, patterns, weak points. For the first time that night, beneath the panic and betrayal, a new resolve took shape. Adrian was done being passive, done being managed, dismissed, protected from the truth. Whatever Lena was involved in, whatever this hospital was hiding, he would uncover it, even if it destroyed what was left of his life. Adrian did not leave the hospital that night the way he had entered it. He slipped out through a side stairwell just before dawn, his body moving on instinct, while his mind lagged behind, still trapped in the image of Lena standing beneath surgical lights. Outside, the rain had slowed to a thin mist, coating the pavement in a dull sheen that reflected the building like a distorted mirror. He sat in his car for nearly an hour, hands gripping the steering wheel, replaying everything again and again, searching for a version of events that made sense. There wasn't one. By morning, the hospital had issued a statement. Lena's condition, they claimed, had stabilized after a routine emergency procedure. Visiting hours were suspended. Family members were advised to rest. When Adrian called, he was transferred from one department to another until the line went dead. By noon, his number stopped going through entirely. The silence felt deliberate. He returned later that afternoon, dressed differently, calmer on the surface. He kept his head down, avoided the main desk, and waited near the elevators like someone who belonged there. From a distance, he watched the staff. Patterns emerged quickly. Certain doctors moved freely between restricted floors. Security guards responded faster to some alarms than others. And always, there was a subtle tension, like everyone knew something they weren't allowed to say. Adrian asked a nurse if he could see his wife. She glanced at his wristband, frowned, and told him Lena had been transferred overnight. When he asked where, she hesitated just long enough to confirm his suspicions before offering a vague answer about specialized care. He thanked her politely and stepped away, his chest tightening. Transfers left paper trails. Unless someone didn't want one. That night, alone in the apartment that no longer felt like home, Adrian went through Lena's things. He had avoided doing this before, telling himself privacy mattered. Now, privacy felt like a luxury built on lies. He checked her laptop first. Password protected. Her phone next. Locked. Wiped clean of recent messages. Even her calendar had been scrubbed down to bland entries that meant nothing. What he did find was a second phone, hidden in the lining of her work bag. It was old, nearly dead, but still functional. Messages flooded the screen once it powered on. Names he didn't recognize. Conversations written in clipped, Professional language, no affection, no hesitation. They spoke of phases, viability, risk management. One thread stood out, marked urgent, time-stamped, just hours before the hospital called him. The final message read, "He knows nothing. Proceed as planned." Adrian felt the floor tilt beneath him. The next few days passed in a blur of half-sleep and obsession. He called former colleagues, pretending to reconnect, probing for information. He searched public records, private clinics, research grants tied to Lena's field. Her name appeared in places it shouldn't have, linked to shell organizations and medical initiatives buried under layers of bureaucracy. The deeper he dug, the clearer it became that Lena's illness was not a misfortune, but a role she had chosen to play, and he had been cast as something expendable. On the fourth day, someone followed him home. Adrian noticed the car 2 blocks away, matching his turns. Slowing when he slowed, he didn't confront it. Instead, he walked into a crowded grocery store and waited until the pressure lifted. When he stepped back outside, the car was gone. The message, however, was unmistakable. Stop looking. The warning only hardened his resolve. Late that evening, a number he didn't recognize flashed across his phone. He almost ignored it. Almost. The voice on the other end was low, strained, and familiar in a way that made his pulse spike. It was the doctor from the operating wing, the one who had warned him. He spoke quickly, as if every second mattered. He told Adrian they were being monitored, that the hospital wasn't just a hospital, that certain patients were never meant to leave. Before Adrian could ask for details, the line cut out. Minutes later, a text followed with a single address and a time. Against his better judgment, Adrian went. The place was a dim cafe near the edge of the city, nearly empty at that hour. The doctor sat in the back, hunched, eyes darting toward the windows. He looked older than Adrian remembered, worn down by fear. He didn't waste time on pleasantries. He told Adrian about experimental trials disguised as treatments, about donors who paid for outcomes rather than cures, about spouses and relatives who were liabilities if they knew too much. "Your wife isn't sick," the doctor said quietly. "She never was. She volunteered. She benefits. You don't." Adrian asked why he had been warned, why the doctor was risking his life. The answer was simple: guilt. He had seen too many disappearances, signed too many falsified reports. That night, when he saw Adrian running toward the operating room, desperate and unarmed with truth, something in him broke. "They were going to sedate you," he said. "Claim a breakdown. Maybe worse." The meeting ended abruptly when a black SUV slowed outside the cafe. The doctor left through the kitchen. Adrian waited until his coffee went cold before following. By the time he reached the street, the SUV was gone. So was the doctor. Adrian stood there under flickering streetlights, the weight of reality pressing down on him. His marriage had been a cover, his love, a convenience, and the woman he thought he knew had chosen power over humanity. He understood now that this wasn't just about survival. It was about exposure. And if he failed, he wouldn't just lose his wife. He would lose himself completely. Adrian stopped going home after the doctor vanished. The apartment felt compromised, every familiar corner suddenly hostile. As if the walls themselves were listening, he moved between cheap motels and all-night diners, paying in cash, keeping his phone off, unless absolutely necessary. Sleep came in fragments, haunted by the same image: Lena beneath the surgical lights, eyes clear, expression unreadable. The hospital released another update 2 days later. Lena was recovering well, they said. No visitors allowed, no estimated discharge date. The language was carefully neutral, designed to calm without explaining anything. Adrian read it 3 times, anger tightening his jaw. If she was recovering, why did no one know where she was? He decided to stop searching for her directly. Instead, he focused on the people around her. Lena's professional circle had always been distant. Exclusive. Now, Adrian understood why. Emails went unanswered. Former colleagues claimed ignorance. A few reacted too defensively, insisting they had nothing to do with her personal life. That distinction alone told him he was circling something dangerous. One name surfaced repeatedly in the documents Adrian had copied from the second phone, a private research consortium with no public address, no leadership listed, only funding numbers that climbed into the tens of millions. Every trail looped back to the same hospital system, the same wing he had been pulled from the night everything unraveled. Adrian returned there after dark. Not as a husband this time, but as an observer. He watched staff change shifts, noted license plates, memorized faces. The building had a rhythm, and beneath it, an undercurrent of control. Security didn't just monitor entrances. They monitored behavior. Anyone who lingered too long was redirected. Anyone who asked the wrong questions was flagged. Near midnight, Adrian spotted a woman sitting alone near the employee entrance. She wore scrubs, her shoulders tense, fingers worrying the strap of her bag. He recognized her from earlier visits, a nurse who had once almost spoken to him, then stopped herself. He waited until the area cleared before approaching. He didn't mention Lena. He didn't mention the operating room. He simply asked if she was all right. The question broke something open. Her eyes filled, just briefly, before she wiped them away and told him to leave her alone. "I can't help you," she whispered. "You shouldn't be here." "I know," Adrian said softly. "Neither should she. I can't help." That was enough. They didn't speak again until an hour later, in the parking structure 3 blocks away. She introduced herself only by her first name, voice shaking as she explained that she had tried to report irregularities once. The complaint had disappeared. Her supervisor had been reassigned. Another nurse, who pushed harder, had been accused of stealing medication and fired on the spot. "They make examples," she said. "Quiet ones." She confirmed what the doctor had told Adrian, filling in gaps with details that made his stomach turn. Patients selected for certain trials weren't always volunteers. Some were pressured, others were bait. Spouses, relatives, anyone who might interfere, were neutralized with diagnoses that couldn't be easily disproven. "Your wife," she hesitated, then continued. "She's not like the others. She's part of it. She signs off on protocols. She decides who qualifies." The betrayal landed with a dull finality. Adrian had already known the truth in pieces. Hearing it spoken aloud only sealed it. Before they parted, the nurse handed him a flash drive. She said it contained fragments, shift logs, internal messages, altered patient records. Not enough to expose the entire network, but enough to prove intent. "If they realize I gave this to you," she said, "I won't last a week." Adrian promised her protection, though he wasn't sure how he would deliver it. She nodded anyway, desperate enough to believe him. The next morning, his phone rang from an unlisted number. This time, there was no attempt at subtlety. A man's voice, calm and impersonal, informed Adrian that his wife was concerned about his well-being. They suggested he stop spreading false narratives. They reminded him that grief could impair judgment and that help was available if he needed it. Adrian ended the call without responding. Minutes later, another message arrived. A photo, his car, parked outside the diner he had just left. The threat was clear. They were watching. They had always been watching. That night, Adrian listened to the recordings on the flash drive, each one confirming the depth of deception. Voices discussed human lives as data points. Failures were written off, successes were monetized, and through it all, Lena's voice appeared more than once, measured, confident, entirely unrecognizable. He didn't cry. He didn't rage. Something colder settled in his chest. Clarity. If he ran, they would erase him. If he confronted Lena directly, they would paint him unstable. The only way out was forward, through exposure so public it couldn't be buried, so undeniable it forced accountability. Adrian backed everything up, sending copies to secure servers, to journalists who specialized in medical ethics, to agencies known for slow but relentless investigations. He didn't know which would respond. He only knew he couldn't afford silence. As dawn broke, Adrian made a decision that terrified him more than anything. So far, he would let them believe he was breaking. He would act lost, reckless, predictable. He would become the version of himself they expected. And when they moved in to finish the trap they had started in that operating room, he would be ready. Adrian let the cracks show on purpose. He stopped answering messages from journalists. He canceled the burner phone he'd been using and switched back to his personal number, the one they already knew. He returned to the apartment in daylight, leaving the curtains open, letting the place look exactly as it would if a man had finally run out of fight. He ordered food he barely touched. He paced. He stared at walls. He made sure anyone watching would see a version of him that felt familiar, confused, wounded, harmless. It worked faster than he expected. On the third evening, the hospital called again. A woman introduced herself as a patient liaison, her tone gentle, rehearsed. Lena wanted to see him, she said. She had been asking. She was worried. There were conditions, of course. A private visit, no recording devices. A security escort for his own safety. Adrian agreed, without hesitation. He even let his voice shake. They brought him in through a service entrance, past doors he hadn't known existed. The hallway smelled different here. Cleaner, colder, no windows, no artwork. Just white light and cameras tucked into corners like unblinking eyes. Adrian felt the old fear claw at his chest, but he kept walking. The room they led him to wasn't a patient room. It looked more like a conference suite, dressed up to resemble one. A bed, untouched. Medical equipment that hummed without purpose. And Lena, seated in a chair by the window, dressed neatly. Hair pulled back, posture composed. She smiled when she saw him, not warmly, not cruelly, just enough to unsettle. "You look tired," she said. Adrian stood still, taking her in. No IV lines, no monitors attached, not even the faint exhaustion that weeks of illness should have left behind. The injustice of it burned his throat. He forced himself to speak calmly. "They told me you almost died. They tell people what's necessary," she replied. "You, of all people, should understand that." A silence stretched between them, thick with everything unsaid. Adrian noticed the guard outside the door, the faint reflection of another camera in the glass. This wasn't a reunion. It was a performance. "I saw you," he said finally. In the operating room, Lena's eyes flickered, just for a second. Then the mask settled back into place. "You weren't supposed to," she said. "That was unfortunate." The casual way she dismissed it nearly broke him. Nearly. Instead, he leaned into the pain, letting it shape his voice. "Why?" he asked. "Was any of it real?" She studied him, as if weighing options, calculating risk. "Our marriage was real," she said carefully. "At first, but you wanted a simple life. I needed more. You used me. I protected you," she corrected, "until you became a liability." The words landed like a verdict. Adrian felt the last pieces of denial crumble. This was the woman he had loved. This was who she had chosen to become. Lena leaned forward. "You've been digging," she said softly. "Talking to people. Sending things you don't fully understand. That's dangerous." "For who?" Adrian asked. "For you," she replied. "These systems don't forgive disruption. They erase it." He nodded slowly, as if conceding the point. Inside, he counted exits, angles, time. He had memorized the room the moment he walked in. He knew where the blind spots were. He knew where the microphones likely sat. "I'm tired," he said. "I don't want to fight anymore." Relief crossed her face before she could stop it. "Then stop," she said. "Sign a statement. Publicly retract everything. Admit you've been unwell. We'll arrange care. You can rest." "Care?" Adrian almost laughed. Instead, he reached into his pocket and placed a folded paper on the table. Lena glanced at it, puzzled, then annoyed. What's that? A timeline? Adrian said. Dates, names, procedures, outcomes. Her smile vanished. You don't have enough, she said sharply. You think fragments scare me? No, Adrian said. I think patterns do. Before she could respond, the door opened. Two men entered, not hospital staff. Security, but not the kind that wore badges. One of them addressed Lena quietly, urgency bleeding through his controlled tone. She stood abruptly, anger flashing. What happened? She demanded. The man glanced at Adrian. There's been a breach. External servers. Journalists are calling. Adrian felt a pulse of grim satisfaction. Not everything had gone dark after all. Lena turned back to him, eyes blazing now. The final mask stripped away. You did this. I told you, Adrian said, voice steady. I'm done being managed. She stepped closer, lowering her voice. You think exposure will save you. They'll bury the story, they'll discredit you, and when it's over, you'll still be nothing. The cruelty was clean, precise. It confirmed everything. Adrian met her gaze. Maybe, he said, but not quiet. Alarms sounded somewhere deeper in the building. Raised voices followed. The men moved to escort Lena out. She hesitated, looking at Adrian one last time, searching for something: fear, regret, control. She found none. As they led her away, Adrian exhaled slowly. He hadn't won. Not yet. But the trap had sprung in a way they hadn't planned. And now, the truth was moving, too fast to be contained. Outside, cameras waited. Questions were already forming. Adrian stepped into the light, knowing the next phase would be louder, harsher, and impossible to undo. He was no longer hiding. The moment Adrian stepped outside the hospital, the night erupted. Camera lights flared. Microphones surged forward, voices overlapping in a chaotic roar. He hadn't expected them so soon. Someone had leaked faster than planned. The questions came sharp and relentless about his wife, about the allegations, about his mental state. Adrian said nothing. He had learned that silence, when timed correctly, spoke louder than denial. A security team formed a tight perimeter and rushed him toward a waiting car. As the door slammed shut, the noise vanished, replaced by the low hum of the engine and the steady rhythm of his own breathing. His hands shook now that the adrenaline was fading. He pressed them against his thighs, grounding himself. This was the point of no return. Within hours, the narrative began to shift. News sites published cautious headlines. Anonymous sources hinted at a disgruntled spouse and misinterpreted research data. By morning, counterclaims appeared, framing Adrian as unstable, emotionally compromised by stress and paranoia. It was exactly what he had anticipated. What he hadn't anticipated was how quickly they would escalate. The first legal notice arrived before noon, a cease and desist, accusing him of defamation and unauthorized data access. The second accused him of stalking hospital personnel. The third suggested a mandatory psychological evaluation for his own safety. Each document was polite, professional, and threatening in its restraint. Adrian didn't respond. Instead, he forwarded everything to the same journalists he'd contacted earlier, adding a single line. Notice the pattern. By afternoon, his bank account was frozen, his credit cards declined, even his email access vanished behind a wall of security reviews. It was a systematic erasure, designed to isolate and exhaust him. He moved again that night, leaving the apartment for good, carrying only a backpack and the flash drive that now felt heavier than it should. He met the nurse in a public place, crowded and loud. She looked worse than before, pale, eyes shadowed, flinching at every sudden sound. She told him 2 administrators had been placed on leave. Another had vanished entirely. The doctor who warned Adrian was officially listed as having resigned. They're closing ranks, she whispered, and they know it leads back to me. Adrian felt the familiar surge of guilt, sharp and unwelcome. He had promised protection without knowing how to give it. Now, someone else was paying the price for his refusal to stay silent. That night, the first long-form investigation dropped. It didn't name Lena directly, but it outlined the structure, private funding, experimental protocols, falsified consent. It included redacted excerpts from internal communications, enough to raise questions, enough to make the truth harder to bury. The response was swift and vicious. Adrian's face appeared on every screen, accompanied by phrases like alleged, unstable, emotionally compromised. Old colleagues were interviewed, carefully chosen to suggest concern without offering support. A former neighbor described him as quiet, intense. The implication was clear. He was not a whistleblower. He was a man unraveling. The injustice cut deeper than any accusation. Adrian had spent his life being dependable, invisible in the best way. Now that same quiet nature was being weaponized against him. Late that evening, his phone rang again. This time, the number wasn't blocked. Lena's voice came through clean and steady. "You're making this worse," she said. "For yourself, for everyone." Adrian closed his eyes. Hearing her now, stripped of pretense, felt like reopening a wound he thought had finally sealed. "They froze my accounts," he replied calmly. "That wasn't concern. That was punishment. You forced our hand," she said. "You could have walked away." "I tried," he said. "You pulled me into an operating room and called it care." There was a pause, not hesitation. "Calculation. They're preparing an evaluation order," Lena said. "Once that happens, nothing you say will matter." Adrian understood the threat. A psychiatric hold would erase his credibility overnight. He would become a cautionary footnote instead of a witness. "I won't fight it," he said, after a moment. Lena inhaled sharply. "What? I'm tired," he repeated, using the same words he had used before. "I'll cooperate." Relief crept into her voice. "Good. That's wise." They ended the call without another word. Adrian moved quickly after that. He transferred remaining files to new locations, scheduled timed releases, and sent detailed instructions to 2 independent investigators. If anything happened to him, anything, the full archive would go public. He left nothing to chance. When the order came the next morning, he didn't resist. He went quietly, allowed himself to be escorted, allowed himself to be assessed. He answered questions honestly, calmly, carefully. He described events without speculation, emotion without exaggeration. He watched as evaluators exchanged looks that suggested confusion. This was not the breakdown they had been promised. Still, the hold remained. Inside the facility, time slowed, days blurred together, under constant observation. Adrian said little. He listened more. He learned how easily narratives were shaped by repetition rather than truth, how language could confine just as effectively as locked doors. Then, on the 5th day, everything shifted. A federal warrant was served at the hospital. Then another. The story broke wide open, too large now to contain. Names surfaced. Documents leaked. The research consortium dissolved overnight. Its silence louder than any denial. Arrests followed. Not everyone. Not yet. But enough. Adrian was released that evening, with an apology that rang hollow, but sufficient. Outside, reporters waited again, but this time, their questions were different. This time, they asked about accountability. Adrian didn't answer them either. He walked away, knowing the battle wasn't over. But the lie had finally cracked, and for the first time since the operating room doors had opened, he felt something close to solid ground beneath his feet. Freedom didn't feel like relief. It felt like standing in the aftermath of a storm, surrounded by debris, unsure which structures would collapse next. Adrian walked away from the facility with nothing but his backpack and a borrowed jacket. The air outside sharp against his skin. Reporters shouted questions he didn't answer. Police cruisers idled nearby. Engines running, as if even now the world wasn't quite ready to let him go. He didn't go back to the city. Instead, Adrian took a bus north, disappearing into smaller towns where faces didn't recognize him yet. He needed distance, not to hide, but to think. The story was moving on its own now, driven by forces larger than him. That should have felt like victory. It didn't. Each night, he followed the updates on a cracked tablet, reading about investigations expanding, committees forming, spokespeople resigning. Lena's name appeared briefly, then vanished again, behind careful legal phrasing. She had lawyers. She had insulation. She always had. The nurse contacted him on the third day. She was safe, relocated under protective measures that were real this time. Her message was short, exhausted, but grateful. Adrian stared at the screen for a long moment before replying. He didn't know how to express what that meant to him without sounding inadequate. Guilt lingered anyway. The truth had cost people. It always did. Adrian thought often about Lena, not with longing, but with a strange clinical curiosity. How long had she been planning this life? When had love turned into leverage? He replayed old conversations, searching for the moment where the shift became inevitable. There was no single turning point, just a series of choices, each one easier than the last. One evening, as rain traced thin lines down the bus window, Adrian received a message from an investigative journalist he had contacted weeks earlier. The subject line was simple: "There's more." The journalist explained that while the hospital network was under scrutiny, a deeper layer had emerged. Shell organizations linked to international trials, financial trails that crossed borders. Lena's role, it turned out, had been both significant and replaceable. She was a gatekeeper, not the architect. They'll sacrifice her if they need to, the journalist wrote. Or they'll protect her if she stays useful. We don't know which yet. Adrian closed the message, a familiar heaviness settling in his chest. He had never wanted revenge, but the idea that Lena might escape accountability entirely felt like another injustice waiting to happen. 2 days later, she called him. He almost didn't answer. Almost, but avoidance had never served him well. She sounded different now. Not weaker, sharper, controlled. She skipped pleasantries. "You've ruined things," she said. Adrian leaned back against the motel bed, eyes on the ceiling. "You ruined them long before I noticed." "They're turning on each other," Lena continued. "This wasn't the plan." Adrian said nothing. Silence invited honesty. "They think I leaked more than I did," she admitted. "They think I'm unstable." The irony would have been amusing if it hadn't been tragic. "You know how this ends," she said quietly. "One of us disappears, figuratively or literally." Adrian felt the old fear stir, but it didn't take hold. "It doesn't have to," he replied. "Tell the truth, all of it." A bitter laugh escaped her. "You still don't understand. Truth is just another asset." The call ended without goodbye. That night, Adrian dreamed for the first time in weeks, not of hospitals or alarms, but of ordinary moments, a shared meal, quiet laughter, the life he thought he was building. He woke with tears on his face and no memory of when he'd started crying, healing. He realized it wasn't a straight line. It was a series of small confrontations with grief you thought you'd already processed. The next phase arrived unexpectedly. Adrian was summoned to testify before a preliminary ethics panel, not a courtroom. Not yet. A room filled with people who spoke carefully and listened selectively. He told his story again, measured and precise. He provided timelines. He avoided speculation. He watched as some members leaned forward, interested, while others avoided eye contact. When Lena entered the room later, escorted but composed, Adrian felt a jolt he hadn't anticipated. She looked smaller somehow, not diminished, contained. She didn't look at him. Their testimonies overlapped but never touched. She framed her actions as compliance, as professional obligation. She painted herself as a cog, not a driver. It was a familiar strategy. When Adrian was asked if he believed Lena had ever loved him, the room went still. He considered the question carefully. "I believe she loved what I provided," he said finally. "I don't know if she ever loved me." It was the truth, and speaking, It felt like setting something down he had been carrying for years. The panel adjourned without resolution. Investigations would continue. Charges were possible. Nothing was guaranteed. Outside, Adrian stood alone on the steps, the weight of uncertainty heavy but no longer paralyzing. He had done what he could. The rest was beyond his control. As night fell, Adrian walked through unfamiliar streets, blending into the quiet anonymity he once feared. He understood now that healing didn't come from reclaiming the past, but from releasing it. Whatever happened next, whatever fate awaited Lena or the system that enabled her, Adrian would face it as himself, not as someone else's shield. And for the first time since the trap had closed around him, that felt like enough. The weeks that followed blurred into a tense waiting game, one Adrian had never trained for. There were no more dramatic confrontations, no alarms or whispered warnings. Instead, there was silence, strategic, suffocating silence. Investigations crawled forward behind closed doors, slowed by bureaucracy and legal maneuvering. Headlines shifted to newer scandals. The world's attention span moved on, but Adrian remained suspended in the consequences. He tried to rebuild a routine, morning walks, simple meals, long hours without screens. At first, the quiet felt earned. Then it started to feel like punishment. Every idle moment left space for questions with no clean answers. Would justice actually arrive, or would this end the way so many stories did, diluted, deferred, forgotten? One afternoon, a package arrived without a return address. Inside was a single folder and a handwritten note. The handwriting was unmistakable. "You deserve to know how far this goes." Adrian's pulse quickened as he opened the folder. It contained internal memos, timelines, financial transfers documents, far more detailed than anything he had seen before. This wasn't just research misconduct. It was an entire ecosystem built on exploitation, protected by legal gray zones and political favors, and threaded through it all were signatures and approvals that led far beyond Lena. At the bottom of the stack was a personal letter from her. She wrote without apology or affection. She wrote like someone documenting a case study. She explained how the system recruited people like her ambitious, disciplined, morally flexible, how it rewarded compliance and punished hesitation, how she had justified each step by telling herself she was advancing progress, not destroying lives. At the end, one line stood apart from the rest. "I don't know when I stopped seeing you as a person and started seeing you as risk." Adrian folded the letter carefully and set it aside. The words hurt less than he expected. They confirmed what he had already accepted. Love, when filtered through power, rarely survived intact. The documents forced a new decision. He could hand everything over and let the process continue its slow grind. Or he could accelerate it, knowing full exposure would trigger retaliation, not just against him, but against others already exhausted by the fallout. He chose a third option. Adrian met with the journalists again, this time face to face, in a quiet office, far from cameras. He laid out the evidence, explained the structure, and named the players he believed were still untouchable. He didn't demand publication. He asked for patience, coordination, and precision. "If this comes out wrong," he said, "they'll spin it into noise. It has to be undeniable." The journalists agreed. For the first time since this began, Adrian felt like he wasn't carrying the truth alone. That night, Lena was arrested. The news broke early, stripped of drama but heavy with implication. Charges related to conspiracy, obstruction, and ethical violations. Bail denied pending further investigation. Her legal team released a statement within hours, insisting on her cooperation and innocence. It read like every other statement of its kind. Adrian read it once and turned the screen off. He didn't feel vindicated. He felt tired, the kind of tired that settled into bones and refused to be shaken off. Justice, he realized, was not a surge of triumph. It was a slow recalibration of reality. Days later, he was called to testify again, this time under oath. The room was colder, the questions sharper. He answered them all. He spoke about the operating room, the warning, the manipulation. He spoke about trust weaponized against intimacy. When asked if he believed Lena felt remorse, Adrian paused. "I believe she feels inconvenience," he said. "I don't know if she knows what remorse is." The testimony made waves, not explosive ones, ripples, enough to keep the story alive. When it was over, Adrian walked out into daylight that felt strangely gentle. He sat on the courthouse steps and watched people pass by, unaware of how close they often came to becoming data points in someone else's ambition. The thought chilled him. Healing began in unexpected ways, not through closure, but through connection. Strangers wrote to him, some grateful, some angry, some confessing experiences they had never spoken aloud. Adrian read them all. He responded when he could. Each message reminded him that his story was not isolated. It was part of a larger pattern, one that thrived on silence. He started therapy at the urging of someone who understood trauma better than he did. The sessions were uncomfortable at first. He wasn't used to centering his own pain. But slowly, he learned to separate guilt from responsibility, to name betrayal without internalizing it. One evening, as he walked home under a sky just beginning to darken, Adrian realized something had shifted. The weight was still there, but it no longer defined every step. He could imagine a future that wasn't built in reaction to the past. Lena's trial loomed ahead, uncertain and complicated. The system she served would fight to protect itself. Some would walk away unscathed. That was the truth he had to accept. But the lie that he was powerless, expendable, invisible, had been dismantled. Adrian unlocked his door and stepped inside, not into safety, but into something closer to agency. He didn't know how the story would end. He only knew he was no longer trapped inside it. The trial did not arrive with spectacle. There were no dramatic arrests broadcast live, no shouted confessions on courthouse steps. Instead, it unfolded the way systems preferred, slowly, methodically, grinding forward behind layers of procedure designed to exhaust everyone involved. Adrian learned quickly that truth was not enough. It had to survive process. He was called in repeatedly, sometimes for hours, sometimes for minutes. Each session reopening wounds he thought had finally begun to scar over. Prosecutors asked him to describe Lena again and again, not as his wife, but as a sequence of behaviors, decisions, signatures. They wanted facts stripped of emotion. They wanted the man, not the husband. Adrian gave them what they asked for. He spoke with precision, not bitterness. He learned when to pause, when to clarify, when to let silence sit unfilled. The more restrained he was, the more seriously they took him. It was another quiet injustice. Pain only mattered when presented calmly. Outside the courtroom, the narrative continued to fracture. Some outlets framed Lena as a symbol of systemic rot. Others painted her as a scapegoat, a convenient villain offered up to protect those above her. Adrian recognized both versions as incomplete. She was neither monster nor martyr. She was a willing participant who had made her choices with open eyes. One afternoon, as he waited in a side room with stale coffee and fluorescent lighting, Adrian was approached by a woman he didn't recognize. She introduced herself as a former patient advocate from another state, someone who had followed the case closely. "You don't know me," she said, "but what you did gave people permission to speak." She handed him a list, names, dates, brief descriptions, survivors of trials that had never officially existed, families who had accepted vague explanations because the alternative was too painful to pursue. Adrian scanned the page, his throat tightening. This was the scale he had never fully grasped. The trap he had stumbled into was just one of many. That night, he couldn't sleep. The room felt too quiet, his thoughts too loud. He replayed the operating room again, but this time, it didn't hold the same power. The fear had dulled. In its place was something heavier. Responsibility, not obligation. He owed no one his destruction, but awareness. He had seen behind the curtain, and he couldn't pretend otherwise. The defense began its counteroffensive soon after. They questioned Adrian's credibility. Not directly, but through implication. They suggested emotional bias, selective memory, stress-induced misinterpretation. An expert witness spoke at length about how trauma could distort perception. Adrian listened from his seat, hands folded, face neutral, as his own experience was reframed into a liability. When it was his turn to respond, he didn't argue theory. He returned to sequence. "This happened," he said. "Then this, then this. These are timestamps. These are documents. These are voices." Facts didn't care about motive. They existed regardless. Lena was present for most of the proceedings. She avoided his gaze entirely, focusing instead on her counsel, her notes, the careful performance of composure. Once, during a recess, their eyes met by accident. For a fleeting moment, something like recognition passed between them. Not remorse, not anger, recognition. As if she finally saw him, not as a variable, but as a consequence. Adrian looked away first. The pressure intensified. He received anonymous messages urging him to settle, to stop cooperating, to consider his future. One message referenced the nurse by name. Another mentioned a journalist who had gone quiet unexpectedly. The system was still moving, still protecting itself. Adrian forwarded everything to the authorities and changed his routines again. He refused to be intimidated into silence. Fear, he had learned, only grew when indulged. In the midst of it all, something unexpected happened. Adrian was invited to speak privately with a small ethics committee unaffiliated with the trial. They weren't interested in prosecution. They wanted insight, how manipulation worked at an emotional level, how trust was exploited before consent was violated. They listened differently. They asked questions that suggested prevention, not just punishment. For the first time since this began, Adrian felt useful in a way that didn't cost him pieces of himself. The day the verdict was announced, the courtroom was half empty. Lena was found guilty on multiple counts. Not all. Enough. Sentencing would come later. Appeals were inevitable. The outcome was neither clean nor complete. Adrian felt no rush of triumph, only a quiet release, like a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Outside, reporters waited again. He stopped this time, not for them, but for himself. "This isn't closure," he said simply. "It's accountability. There's a difference." He left before questions followed. That evening, Adrian walked through a park near his temporary apartment, watching the sun dip behind trees, just beginning to lose their leaves. Life moved on around him, children laughing, couples arguing softly, strangers passing without recognition. The ordinariness of it all felt fragile and precious. He knew the story wasn't finished. Systems rarely collapsed all at once, but something fundamental had shifted. The trap that had nearly erased him had instead exposed itself. Adrian sat on a bench and allowed himself, finally, to feel something like hope, not the naive kind he once built his life on, but a steadier version earned. Cautious, real, whatever came next, he would meet it as someone who had survived the truth and chosen not to look away. Time did not heal, so much as it reorganized the damage. In the months after the verdict, Adrian learned how quickly attention faded once headlines stopped delivering novelty. The investigations continued, but quietly now, buried beneath other crises, competing for outrage. Appeals were filed, motions delayed sentencing. The system returned to its preferred rhythm, slow, patient, exhausting. Adrian tried to live inside that lull without letting it swallow him. He found part-time work consulting for an ethics nonprofit, reviewing case frameworks, and advising on survivor protections. The work was meticulous and emotionally taxing, but it gave shape to his days. Purpose, he discovered, was a form of shelter. Still, the past refused to stay contained. Lena's name surfaced again in a leaked brief, suggesting a reduced sentence in exchange for cooperation. Adrian read the article twice, then closed it. Cooperation meant information. Information meant leverage. He understood the calculus. He just hadn't expected the familiar ache that followed an echo of the man he used to be. Hoping for fairness in places that traded it, the ache sharpened when he received a formal request to meet Lena one last time before sentencing. The request came through official channels, framed as optional, therapeutic even. Adrian declined at first. Then he reconsidered. Avoidance had kept him alive once. Now it felt like unfinished business. The meeting took place in a quiet room, with glass walls and a single table. Lena entered wearing neutral colors, hair tied back, hands steady. She looked older, though Adrian couldn't tell if that was time or consequence. They sat across from each other, the space between them small and irrevocable. She spoke first. "I won't apologize," she said. "It would be dishonest." Adrian appreciated the clarity. "Then don't," she nodded, as if relieved. "They want names, structures. I can give them enough to matter." "Do it," Adrian said without hesitation. Her eyes searched his face, perhaps for bitterness, perhaps for permission. She found neither. "I used to think outcomes justified methods," she said quietly. "That progress demanded sacrifice." "And now?" Adrian asked. "Now I think I mistook ambition for inevitability." She paused. "You were never supposed to be collateral." "But you were." Adrian absorbed the words without reacting. He had already done the work of separating responsibility from regret. Her realizations, late as they were, belonged to her. When the meeting ended, Adrian felt lighter than he expected, not absolved, released. Weeks later, sentencing was finalized. The term was significant, though not absolute. Others were named, some indicted, some insulated by distance and time. It was enough to matter, not enough to cleanse the system entirely. Adrian marked the day, not with celebration, but with distance. He took a train out of the city, traveling without destination, watching landscapes blur into one another. He thought about the version of himself who had run through hospital corridors, believing love alone could protect him. He wished that man kindness. On the train, a stranger recognized him, not by name, but by story. She thanked him for speaking up. Then she apologized for intruding. Adrian smiled and told her it was all right. Moments like that no longer startled him. They grounded him. He returned to the city with a decision forming quietly, firmly. He would not build a life defined by reaction. He would choose forward motion. Adrian accepted a full-time role with the nonprofit, relocating to a smaller city where anonymity was easier to come by. He sold what remained of the old apartment's contents and donated the rest. Each box emptied felt like a deliberate exhale. Healing arrived in unremarkable ways. Cooking again, running at dawn, learning to trust his instincts without surrendering to suspicion. Therapy sessions shifted from processing betrayal to mapping boundaries. He learned that vigilance could coexist with openness, that safety did not require isolation. One evening, as he prepared notes for a workshop on informed consent, Adrian realized he no longer replayed the operating room by default. The image surfaced sometimes, but it no longer commanded him. It had become a reference point, not a prison. The final twist came quietly. A class action settlement was announced, funded by seized assets from the consortium. Survivors would receive compensation, counseling, acknowledgement. It wasn't justice in the moral sense, but it was repair in the practical one. Adrian read the notice and felt something settle into place. He stood on his balcony that night, city lights stretching out beneath a clear sky. The world felt vast again, not threatening. Possibility returned. Not as fantasy, but as option. Adrian understood now that traps thrived on silence and speed. He had survived by slowing down, by speaking carefully, by choosing presence over panic. The cost had been high. The return was agency. He turned back inside, ready for the next day, not because it promised peace, but because it belonged to him. The smaller city suited Adrian in ways he hadn't anticipated. There were fewer sirens, fewer sharp edges, fewer reminders of who he had been before everything collapsed. People here moved slower, spoke more directly. They didn't look at him like a headline. Most didn't recognize him at all. That anonymity wasn't emptiness, it was room to breathe. Work settled into a steady rhythm. Adrian reviewed consent frameworks, trained advocates, and sat with survivors who needed someone to listen without trying to fix them. He learned to hold space without absorbing pain as his own. It was a skill he practiced daily, sometimes imperfectly, but with intention. The nonprofit trusted his judgment. He trusted his instincts again. Still, the past found ways to knock. An appeal was filed that challenged the admissibility of key evidence. A technicality, but a dangerous one. If successful, it could unravel months of progress and embolden those waiting to reclaim control. Adrian was asked to consult quietly, urgently. He read the brief late into the night, recognizing the familiar strategy: exhaust the witnesses, outlast the outrage, let time do the work. He drafted a response that was measured and relentless, focusing on sequence and corroboration rather than sentiment. He understood now that persuasion didn't come from volume. It came from coherence. When the panel reconvened, the appeal was denied. Narrowly. Enough. The denial triggered something else. Whispers of retaliation surfaced again. Subtle. Indirect. A funding stream paused. A partner organization hesitated. Old allies grew cautious. The system didn't like losing. It preferred pressure to force compliance. Adrian didn't panic. He convened conversations instead. He named risks plainly, offered alternatives, invited transparency. It was slower than fear, but stronger. When one door closed, another opened. The work continued. On a quiet afternoon, Adrian received a handwritten letter forwarded from an unknown address. Inside was a single page, written with careful restraint. It was from the doctor, the one who had warned him that night and vanished soon after. He was alive, relocated, protected. Finally, the letter contained no details, only gratitude, and one line that stayed with Adrian long after he folded the page away. You reminded me that silence is a choice. That night, Adrian slept without dreams. Weeks later, he was invited to speak at a closed-door forum, attended by regulators, clinicians, and ethicists. Not a keynote, a conversation. He prepared notes, but barely used them. Instead, he spoke about thresholds, the moment when compliance turns into complicity. When ambition crosses into harm. He spoke about how traps are built not with villains, but with incentives. How people convince themselves they are doing necessary work until necessity becomes excuse. The room was quiet when he finished. Not stunned. Reflective. That mattered more. Afterward, a young clinician approached him, eyes bright with worry and resolve. I didn't know how to name what I was seeing, she said. Now I do, Adrian nodded. Naming was the first step. After that came choices. Life outside work grew fuller, gentler. He joined a running group that met before sunrise. He learned the names of neighbors. He cooked meals that weren't rushed. He allowed himself friendships that didn't orbit trauma. Trust returned not as a leap, but as a series of small, earned steps. Then came the call he hadn't expected to want. Lena had entered a cooperation phase that was deeper than anticipated. She had named names, provided structures, offered documentation that reached far beyond the initial scope. The prosecution wanted Adrian's assessment not of her guilt, but of her credibility. He took the call in stride, weighing words carefully. She understands systems, he said, and she understands consequences now. That doesn't absolve her. It contextualizes her. It was enough. Months later, a cascade followed. New indictments, settlements, oversight bodies restructured. Not all at once, not perfectly, but undeniably. The story no longer centered on a single hospital or a single marriage. It had grown into a reckoning. On the anniversary of the night that changed everything, Adrian took the day off. He walked along a river path, watching light break across water. He thought about the man who had sprinted through hallways believing love was a shield. He thought about the fear that had nearly erased him. He felt compassion for both. Adrian stopped at a bench and sat for a long while, breathing in the present. The future no longer felt like a threat to survive. It felt like terrain to explore. When he stood to leave, his phone buzzed with a simple message from a colleague. The protections passed. Unanimous. Adrian smiled, small and genuine. He headed home, not triumphant, but steady. The trap had been dismantled piece by piece. The cost had been real, so had the change. And for the first time since that night, Adrian understood something with quiet certainty. Healing wasn't the absence of scars, it was the ability to live fully with them. The momentum didn't crest all at once. It spread outward, uneven but persistent. Like pressure redistributing through a fault line, oversight committees announced reforms. Hospitals revised consent protocols. Grants were suspended pending audits. None of it felt cinematic, all of it felt necessary. Adrian watched the changes from a distance, aware that progress rarely looked like victory when it arrived. He was asked to join a review panel, not as a witness this time, but as an advisor. The role came with limitations. No media appearances, no public commentary. Just work, Adrian accepted. Influence, he had learned, was most durable when it didn't announce itself. The panel's first meeting was tense. Clinicians bristled at scrutiny. Administrators spoke in careful abstractions. Lawyers hovered at the edges, translating responsibility into risk. Adrian listened, then asked a question that cut through the room. Who benefits if this fails quietly? The silence that followed was answer enough. He spent weeks reading policies written to look protective while remaining porous. He flagged language that allowed discretion to become escape. He pushed for simple rules with clear consequences. Some resisted, others, unexpectedly, leaned in. Change found allies where fear had once lived. Outside the work, Adrian's life continued to expand. He found himself laughing without effort, enjoying moments without scanning them for threat. He started volunteering on weekends with a local mediation group, helping neighbors resolve disputes before they calcified into harm. The skills translated: listening, naming, boundaries, repair. Then the letter arrived. It wasn't from Lena. It was from someone who had been harmed by the same system years earlier. Someone who had lost a sibling to a complication never fully explained. The letter was careful, grateful, and restrained. It didn't ask for anything. It simply said that knowing the truth existed somewhere had made grief less isolating. Adrian read it twice and sat quietly for a long time. The cost of speaking up had been immense. The return was not applause, but connection. That felt right. The next phase demanded a different courage. Adrian was invited to testify at a legislative hearing, considering nationwide safeguards. The invitation came with warnings. Opposition groups would attempt to undermine credibility, to reframe the narrative as exceptional rather than systemic. He agreed anyway. Silence, he knew, was a choice. The hearing room was larger than any he'd faced before. Cameras mounted like watchful eyes. Adrian kept his statements simple. He told the story, not as a husband betrayed, but as a citizen failed. He described how complexity protected misconduct, how ambiguity anesthetized accountability. He named the moment in the operating room not as trauma, but as revelation. The instant when personal trust collided with institutional secrecy. Questions followed, some supportive, some hostile. One lawmaker asked whether he believed reforms would stifle innovation. Adrian met the question evenly. Innovation that requires deception isn't innovation, he said. It's extraction. The clip traveled farther than he expected. Back home, he tried not to track reactions. Metrics had once consumed him. Now he let the work speak without supervision. He focused on the ordinary dinner with friends, a long run before dawn, the steady pleasure of routine. Then came the call that closed a chapter. Lena's cooperation had concluded. Her sentence was finalized substantial, though mitigated by the breadth of information she provided. The system she had served would never fully reckon with itself, but it had been forced to change its language, its methods, its margins. That mattered. Adrian felt no urge to reach out. The conversation they'd had months earlier was complete. Closure, he understood, wasn't a conversation. It was alignment between truth and action. The nonprofit asked him to consider leading a new initiative focused on survivor-informed policy design. He hesitated, then accepted. Leadership had once scared him. It had felt like exposure. Now, it felt like stewardship. On a cool evening, Adrian walked along the river again, watching lights shimmer across the water. He thought about traps the way they depended on speed, isolation, and silence. He thought about how they failed when people slowed down, connected, and spoke precisely. A message buzzed in his pocket, a simple update from a colleague. Protections implemented in 3 states. More pending. Adrian smiled and kept walking. The work would continue. So would life. Not perfect. Not safe from loss. But honest. He reached his door, unlocked it, and stepped inside, carrying nothing from the past he hadn't chosen to keep. The months that followed brought a quieter kind of pressure, the sort that didn't announce itself but lingered in the background, testing resolve. Adrian learned that reform attracted resistance not only from those who stood to lose power, but from those unsettled by change itself. The work was no longer about exposure. It was about endurance. He stepped into the leadership role carefully, aware that visibility carried risks. Decisions now rippled outward, affecting funding, staffing, and policy language that would shape outcomes long after headlines faded. Adrian insisted on survivor-informed reviews at every stage. Some partners balked, others adapted, a few walked away. He accepted the losses without resentment. Compromise, he had learned, was only useful when it didn't hollow out purpose. One afternoon, a proposal landed on his desk that tested him more than any accusation had. A major institution offered funding significant, stable, transformative, attached to conditions that softened oversight and delayed reporting. The language was elegant. The intent was not. Adrian read it twice, then called a meeting. "We don't take money that asks us to look away," he said simply. The room was quiet. The decision would cost them. Everyone knew it. He signed the refusal himself and sent it without flourish. That night, sleep came easily. Integrity, he realized, was its own rest. Not all challenges were institutional. A smear campaign surfaced quietly online, recycled doubts about his mental health, insinuations about motives. Old phrases resurfaced. Adrian recognized the pattern and refused to engage. He focused on process, not noise. Within weeks, the effort collapsed under its own thinness. Truth didn't need defending when it was already embedded in structure. Healing continued in ordinary increments. Adrian started dating again, not seriously at first, just conversations over coffee, shared walks, gentle curiosity. He was honest about his past, without letting it dominate the present. Some connections faded. One deepened, slowly, built on consent that meant something more than a signature. Trust returned, not as a promise, but as a practice. A turning point came when Adrian was invited to observe a training session for clinicians at a hospital that had adopted the new safeguards. The room was filled with young professionals, attentive and uneasy in equal measure. Adrian listened as facilitators walked through case scenarios, pausing to ask what should happen when a protocol conflicted with a person's autonomy. Hands went up, questions were asked, discomfort surfaced and was allowed to exist. The shift was subtle but profound. Systems changed when people were taught to sit with uncertainty instead of smoothing it over. Afterward, a clinician approached Adrian and said, "I thought ethics was abstract. I didn't realize it was operational." Adrian nodded. "It's operational, or it's ornamental. Later that week, he received a message from the nurse who had helped him at the beginning. She was working again, cautiously, at a different facility. She wrote about moments when she now felt empowered to speak, backed by policy rather than courage alone. Adrian reread the message, grateful for how far the arc had bent. Then came the hearing that few expected. A coalition of agencies convened a review to examine accountability beyond the original scope. Adrian was not a witness this time. He was an observer. Names he recognized appeared in transcripts. Others did not. The system resisted, then conceded inches. It wasn't the reckoning some wanted. It was movement. That would have to be enough? On the anniversary of his release, Adrian took the day off again. He didn't mark it publicly. He didn't revisit old places. He cooked a meal with friends, laughed when something burned, told stories that had nothing to do with hospitals. Later, alone, he walked the neighborhood and noticed details he had missed before. The way light pooled at corners. The sound of someone practicing piano behind an open window. Presence, he thought, was a skill too. A message arrived just before dusk. It was brief. The last outstanding appeal had been denied. Adrian felt the finality settle, not as triumph, but as alignment. The story that had tried to swallow him no longer had teeth. That evening, he sat at his desk and wrote not testimony, not policy, but a letter to himself. He wrote about fear, mistaken for foresight, about love confused with endurance, about the cost of silence and the power of naming. He wrote until the words felt complete, then folded the page and placed it in a drawer he rarely opened. The next morning, work resumed. Emails, meetings, decisions. The rhythm of responsibility. Adrian welcomed it. The ordinary no longer felt fragile. It felt earned. As the city woke around him, Adrian understood something he hadn't before. Endings weren't clean because lives weren't. What mattered was not closure, but continuity, the ability to move forward without dragging the past like a chain. He stepped outside, breathed in cool air, and started the day. Adrian no longer measured time by crises. The days had begun to arrange themselves around intention instead of reaction, and that shift, subtle as it was, changed everything. He woke early, not because anxiety demanded it, but because the morning felt like an invitation. The city outside his window stirred with a quiet confidence, and for the first time in years, he felt in sync with it. The work continued, steady and unglamorous. Policies were revised, trainings expanded, and partnerships tested. Some weeks brought setbacks, funding delays, political pressure, compromises that stung even when they were necessary. Adrian met each challenge with the same discipline he had learned the hard way. Slow down, name the risk, choose the least harmful path. Progress, he had learned, was not a straight line. It was a practice. Healing showed itself in unexpected moments, in laughter that came without permission, in conversations that didn't require vigilance, in the realization that his body no longer tensed at the sound of sirens. Trauma had trained him to anticipate danger. Healing taught him to notice safety. He began to trust his judgment again, not blindly, but respectfully. When doubts surfaced, he examined them without surrendering to them. Therapy helped, but so did ordinary life, the kind that unfolded in grocery aisles, on long runs, in shared silences with people who asked nothing from him but honesty. One evening, he attended a small gathering, hosted by the mediation group he volunteered with. There were no speeches, no agenda, just people sharing food and stories. At some point, someone asked Adrian how he kept going after everything he had been through. The question wasn't intrusive, it was curious. He considered it carefully. "I stopped trying to win," he said. "I started trying to align." The answer surprised him as much as it seemed to satisfy the room. Later that night, walking home beneath a sky brushed with thin clouds, Adrian thought about alignment. How rare it was, how easily disrupted. He had once believed love meant staying, no matter the cost. Now he understood that love without alignment was just endurance, dressed up as virtue. A message arrived from a colleague the next morning. A new hospital system had adopted the full safeguard package. Not partially, not symbolically, fully. Adrian forwarded the message to the nurse, who had risked everything at the beginning. She replied with a single word. Finally, there were moments of grief still. They came quietly, without warning. A song, a smell, a memory of the man he had been before. Trust became a liability. Adrian let the grief pass through without resistance. He no longer tried to outrun it. He no longer let it define him. He found himself thinking less about Lena, not because he had forgiven her, but because her role in his inner life had diminished. Accountability had been addressed. The rest was not his to carry. Letting go, he realized, was not an event. It was a habit. As the year turned, Adrian was asked to help design a national training module focused on consent integrity. The task was complex, the scrutiny intense. He accepted with humility. This was not redemption, it was responsibility. During a pilot session, a participant asked a question that lingered long after the room emptied. What do we do when the system rewards us for looking away? Adrian answered without hesitation. We build systems that reward us for stopping. The simplicity of it felt radical. On a quiet Sunday, Adrian visited a local riverbank where volunteers were restoring native plants. He joined them without introduction, hands in the soil, listening to conversations that had nothing to do with policy or harm. The work was slow, repetitive, grounding. When he left, his clothes were dirty and his mind was clear. That night, he sat at his desk and reviewed the outline for the final report he would soon submit. It wasn't a victory lap. It was a map where safeguards held, where they failed, where vigilance was still required. He wrote with care, knowing the document would outlive his direct involvement. Before shutting down his computer, Adrian paused. He thought about the operating room, the warning, the trap that had almost erased him. He felt gratitude not for the suffering, but for the clarity it had forced upon him. He had learned who he was when the illusion of safety fell away. Adrian closed the file and turned off the light. Tomorrow would bring more work, more choices, more moments that required courage without drama. He was ready for them. For the first time, the future did not feel like something to survive. It felt like something to inhabit. The final stretch did not announce itself as an ending. It arrived quietly, disguised as continuity. Adrian woke on an ordinary morning, brewed coffee, and reviewed notes for a meeting that would shape policies rather than headlines. The absence of urgency felt unfamiliar, almost suspicious, until he recognized it for what it was: stability. The meeting went well. Not perfectly. It didn't need to. Consensus formed around clear language, measurable accountability, and timelines that could not be endlessly deferred. When disagreements surfaced, they were addressed directly, without euphemism. Adrian watched people choose clarity over convenience and felt something loosen in his chest. This was how systems healed, not through spectacle, but through repetition. Later that day, Adrian received confirmation that the national training module had been approved for rollout. The message was brief and procedural. He read it twice, then forwarded it to the small circle who had helped build it. No celebration followed, only gratitude, expressed simply, and a return to work. It felt right. In the weeks that followed, Adrian transitioned out of his leadership role by design. He had learned the danger of becoming indispensable. He trained successors, documented processes, and stepped back without drama. Stewardship, he believed, meant knowing when to let go. Life beyond work continued to widen. He committed to a relationship that felt mutual and grounded, built on conversations that welcomed discomfort rather than avoiding it. He made plans that extended beyond crisis calendars. He laughed more easily. He rested without guilt. One evening, while sorting old files to prepare for the transition, Adrian found the letter he had written to himself months earlier. He read it slowly. The words felt distant but true. like a map drawn during a storm. He folded the page again and returned it to the drawer, not because it was no longer relevant, but because it no longer needed daily attention. A final administrative task remained, closing his involvement in the original case. He submitted a concise memo, thanked the teams, and declined future interviews. The story would continue without him. That, too, felt right. On a clear morning, Adrian took a long walk through the city, noticing how familiar it had become. He passed places where he had once felt anonymous and realized anonymity had transformed into belonging, not because people recognized him, but because he recognized himself within the life he had built. He stopped at a cafe and ordered a drink he used to avoid, too indulgent, he once thought. He sat by the window and watched people pass, each carrying unseen stories. The thought no longer overwhelmed him. It connected him. Adrian reflected on the injustice that had once defined his days, the betrayal, the trap disguised as care. He acknowledged the anger that had fueled him and the fear that had sharpened his choices. He didn't romanticize it. He didn't minimize it. He placed it where it belonged in the past, integrated, instructive, no longer dominant. The lesson was not that systems were evil or that love was dangerous. It was that silence carried a cost, and clarity demanded courage. It was that trust required boundaries, and healing required truth spoken at the right pace. It was that endings didn't erase scars, but they could transform them into markers of survival rather than wounds. As the day unfolded, Adrian felt a quiet confidence settle in. Not certainty, confidence. The kind that came from alignment between values and action, the kind that didn't depend on outcomes. That evening, he returned home and prepared a simple meal. He set the table for two. Conversation flowed easily, unburdened by subtext. When the night deepened, Adrian stepped onto the balcony and looked out at the city lights. He breathed in cool air and let the present anchor him. The story that began in an operating room had carried him through fear, betrayal, exposure, and repair. It had taken nearly everything and given something back that could not be taken again. Agency. Adrian turned inside, ready for tomorrow, not because it promised ease, but because it was his final lesson. Some traps are built with locks and alarms. Others are built with trust, urgency, and silence. This story isn't about medicine or marriage alone. It's about what happens when systems reward compliance over conscience. And when love is mistaken for endurance, healing does not come from erasing the past. It comes from naming it, learning from it, and choosing differently when the moment demands courage instead of comfort. If you ever find yourself silenced by fear or dismissed by power, remember this: clarity is not cruelty, and speaking the truth carefully, persistently, can change more than you imagine. If this story resonated with you, share your thoughts in the comments and tell us where you're watching from and what time it is in your part of the world. And if you want more powerful, cinematic stories about betrayal, truth, and healing, don't forget to subscribe.